Welcome everybody. We're thrilled to have you here for today's webinar on packaging testing, specifically how to establish repeatability and consistency. But before we dive in, there are a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to share with you quickly. Today's session is brought to you by Mecmesin, a proud member of the Physical Properties Testers Group. PPT Group is a collective of leading brands in the field of physical properties testing, offering a wide array of solutions for testing tensile and compressive strength, torque testing, textile testing, and the effects of shock and vibration, among other parameters. Our sister companies within the PPT family include Landsmont, James Hill, and Aluris. For more details about the group or any of our brands, please visit the PPT website. We've also shared a link to our events page in the chat box for your convenience. Now, focusing on Mecmesin, we have established technology labs across the US, UK, and Asia, dedicated to supporting our customers with education, proof of concept, and demonstration testing. Should you have any specific needs in physical properties testing, our global team is at your disposal to provide the assistance that you require. Let's introduce the team for today's webinar. Moses DeRocha, as always, is our presenter, and I'm Sharon Smorenberg, one of the coordinators. Additionally, we have support staff and partners stationed across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, ensuring that no matter where you are, we have a local expert that can work with you. Today, we're aiming for a dynamic and engaging webinar. Therefore, we encourage your participation through questions. Please feel free to submit any questions you have at any point during the webinar using the question box. We will address these during the Q&A session at the end. The webinar is being recorded, as always, for your convenience. The recording will be sent to the address you registered with, allowing you to share it with colleagues or revisit it as needed. Now I can hand it over to Moses.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks everybody for making our webinar today. This is actually a pretty broad topic as far as packaging testing is concerned and all the different capabilities that our entire group has to offer. So for purposes of today's presentation, we've selected 3 specific applications that we're going to be looking at. So just so we're not here until next week. So our agenda is going to be fairly simple today. We'll look at the general overview of packaging testing. We'll look at some of the industries where you find packaging testing being conducted. And then specifically, we'll zero in on top-load testing, edge crush testing, ECT, and then carton or box crush testing, which is often referred to as BCT. And then we'll also look as part of our search for identifying areas that can be improved for establishing repeatability and consistency in testing. Our chief among those are the selection of the ideal tester and the selection of ideal fixtures. And then we'll look at some other factors that usually affect repeatability and consistency. And then hopefully addressing those will help us establish a testing environment that we can all be essentially proud of. So that's going to be our simple agenda for today. As Sharon just mentioned, it would usually be ideal to have people jumping in with questions, but we'd rather take those at the very end of our presentation. And as always, if there are any questions that come up after the webinar, we'll provide an email address so you can reach out to us directly for a one-on-one support. All right, so for starters, why is packaging testing important? So for purposes of research and development, to determine product viability, the strengths and weaknesses of products, or for quality control, for establishing product standards for quality and safety, and determining pass or fail criteria for products. And then in production, for maintaining those preset or established product quality and safety parameters. And then obviously, if you have suppliers that are supplying you products and providing you actual values for what those products are supposed to, the standards the products actually meet, you can indeed audit those products to make sure they do meet the standards that they are actually subscribed to or they're assigned to. So these are the main reasons why you test. Now, obviously, there are additional quality and safety reasons why industries test packaging. I'll use a couple of the packaging samples that we test is child-resistant closure containers for medications or for chemicals and so on. We call these the push and turn type containers. Now imagine it's not more more of a convenience issue if an adult cannot get into their medication bottle, but it becomes a safety issue if a child easily gets into any one of those containers. So at some point, it goes a little beyond the quality issue and becomes a safety issue, and your brand is at stake, and so failure is not an option. So these are some of the reasons why packaging testing is done in all of these industries. There may be some that I have not included, but I'm trying to use an all-encompassing list here in automotive and aerospace, in medical and pharmaceutical, in paper and plastics, in cosmetics, in food and beverage, in manufacturing, in electrical. As I mentioned, there may be others that I may not have included here, but again, I'm trying to focus this particular webinar on the 3 areas that we have selected. And these 3 areas essentially come under the general umbrella of compression testing, whether it's top load testing or carton crush testing or edge crush testing. These are all types of compression testing, which seek to provide data on the integrity and safety of materials, components, and products. It usually involves applying a uniaxial force to measure the performance of test specimen under a compressive load up to the point of yielding or breaking. We'll look at the 3 typical tests that you usually find in compressive testing. And then the samples under test may either be raw material or actual finished products. Test samples are usually compressed with a compression plate or a probe or other special fixtures, and load is applied at a constant rate of speed. Data collected can then be plotted on a graph that shows a force versus extension or displacement or deflection or a stress versus strain curve in materials testing. Compression testing is usually performed, as I mentioned, with plates, compression probes, and fixtures. We'll look at all of those under each of the different test applications that we'll be looking at. And these tests may be destructive or non-destructive tests. Right. So with that in mind, there are 3 major test applications in packaging when it comes to compression testing. In that first scenario, in the test procedure 1, the test is run at a constant rate of speed. The sample is compressed to a known displacement, and then the calculation yields a peak force or a maximum force at that displacement, the target displacement. The test procedure number 2 involves running again at a constant rate of speed and applying a known compressive force to the sample, and then calculating exactly how much the sample deflected. And then in test number 3, this is more of a destructive test where you run at a constant rate of speed until the sample fails or it breaks or buckles or it reaches its point of deformation. And then at that point, you can calculate the force at the point of failure and also the deflection at the point of failure. Now, again, depending on what the industry actually requires or what your own, either whether you're testing to an ASTM standard or an ISO standard or your own internal standard, you're likely to fall under one of these 3 test types. If you're in R&D and you're just looking to learn as much as you can about a product, sometimes it might be necessary to run all 3 tests. So for instance, if you run test 1 and you compress to a known displacement of say a 1/4 inch deflection, and then you measure the max force, you can then run test 2 and say, well, if I apply this X force that we acquired from test 1, are we likely to see that deflection, the known deflection in test 1? So there are different ways of running these tests, and again, your industry will determine which one of these tests you run to, or sometimes you might run all three. So with that said, we'll look at top load testing. So under packaging testing, top load testing is simply the measurement of the maximum or breaking load that a container can withstand under compressive force. So it's performed mainly on blow molded, thermoformed or injection molded plastic containers. We've also tested on aluminum cans, glass bottles. They're all kinds. So all we're doing is applying a compressive load to any container, and then either seeing the force at failure or the deflection at failure, or applying a specific force to see how much the product actually deflects, or run into a known deflection or displacement and then seeing what the maximum force applied is. Again, it measures the compressive strength of containers to ensure they do not deform or break when subjected to axial forces during the processes of filling, closure, storage, and transport. And that's all we're saying. So how do we know that the plastic water bottles are going to, we could be able to stack them in their cartons 10 high, 5 high, 20 high, without the ones on the bottom actually buckling, right? We can only make that determination when we do have the actual top load values to say, all right, these 20-ounce bottles can withstand 200 pounds of axial force. So if we stack them 10 high, they should be fine. However, if we stack them 20 high, then the ones on the bottom might actually buckle or fail. So these are some of the reasons why. And these always apply, whether it's in that process of filling, where your pneumatic fillers actually apply a compressive force to the bottle to hold them down before they're filled, at the point of closure, or when they're in storage and they're stacked, or during the process of transporting them, and also once they get to your distributors or to your store, how they're stacked in storage and so on. Can those bottom ones withstand the whatever axial load that the samples or the cartons or the containers are stacked to? So these are the main reasons why you would run top load testing. Again, all you're doing is you're looking to just provide a standard or a method of obtaining data to determine your acceptance or rejection. In our industry, we say pass or fail specifications, either for quality control or for research and development, and also special designs. One of the things that happens in any testing environment is once you've preset your pass or fail criteria for all future testing, you're then able to determine your pass or fail by saying, on this 20-ounce or 40-ounce bottle, we expect a minimum of 200 pounds. Anything above that is a pass. Anything below that is a fail. And that establishes testing standards for your testing environment in order to determine what's good and what's bad, and so on. All right. Now, choosing the ideal tester for top load testing, usually we could say, hey, go out and just grab a handheld force gauge and just apply the force and then measure some kind of data. But in our experience, we've noticed that using a motorized force tester or a software-driven tester gives you the most consistent and repeatable results. Why? Because there are two critical factors in this particular test: force and displacement. Yes, any load cell or force gauge will record the force resistance, but what if you wanted to apply a specific force and then record the deflection? Obviously, unless you have calibrated forearms, you might not be able to tell exactly how much the sample deflected before failure. And so in that case, in the case of a motorized tester, yes, you'll be able to apply at the constant rate of speed, apply a force or run to a known deflection, and then measure one or the other or both. You get better results with software-driven testers, because then all these nuances that are involved in the test can then be recorded, whether you're doing the procedure type 1, measuring for the max force at a known deflection, or you're doing a test 2, measuring the deflection when a known force is applied, or whether, especially when you're doing performing test number 3, where you're just running to the point of deformation or point of failure and then recording one or both of those values as far as force and or deflection. So these are the types of testers that we would recommend in any typical top load testing application. The other advantage of using a software-driven tester is also that there are other factors in a typical top-load test that you might be interested in recording. For instance, if you're in the blow molding industry and you'd also like to record the height of your containers, software-driven testers will allow you to do that, where you will set a preset 0 point, come down, touch the top of the container before compressing in order to measure that, so you'd be able to acquire that additional data as part of your top load test data. So these are the types of testers we would recommend. The next part is, once you've selected your tester, what are some of the types of fixtures that are ideal for a top load test? So in most top load testing, especially for thermal injections or blow molding, blow molded containers, you'll find all types of compression platens. These will come in different sizes and materials, whether they're plastic for very light material, or aluminum or stainless steel, and they'll come in all sizes, anywhere from, you know, a quarter of an inch in diameter up to whatever the opening of your container is, 10 inches, 13 inches, and so on. And then these may be shaped as round, square, or rectangular, depending on the shape of your containers. And these can also be vented or non-vented, as in using vented compression plates. These are usually used on empty containers, and in order not to build up pressure and spike your compressive force values, we use the vented compression plate to essentially let out the air, so you can kind of focus on the actual structural integrity of the samples that you're testing. And then we use the non-vented compression platens on samples that are pretty much ready for market, filled and capped containers, which is more of a real life test application, especially in order to determine whether they'll survive however many cases are stacked in transporting from production floor to the store, and so on. And then there are also rubber-phased samples for rubber-phased compression platens that prevent any slippage on the surfaces of samples that are usually unusually smooth. And then there are self-leveling compression platens that are used for uneven surfaces on samples. There are also cone-pointed samples that essentially the cone enters the opening in the bottle and offers you that vented hole to let out the air before you compress. You'll find these in usually bottle designs and so on. So these are the types of compression platens that you would find in any typical top load test, whether it's a plastic product or aluminum or steel or glass for that matter. Right. And edge crush testing is the next test application that we will be looking at. Now, edge crush testing, or ECT as it's popularly known in the industry, is essentially just the measurement of the edgewise compressive strength of corrugated cardboard. Since the edges and corners of a box are mostly responsible for bearing the load, the test captures the material strength of that box using that edge crush testing. This test is measured by compressing a defined piece of corrugated cardboard on its edge between two rigid platens. This compression test is performed perpendicularly to the direction of the flutes until the board collapses and a peak load is reached. Force is reported as a force per unit width, which is the width of the sample being tested. And then if reported as an ECT value, for example, 44 ECT instead of say 44 pounds or 20 pounds, the minimum value corresponds to the pounds per inch width. So you'll find probably 2-inch wide by 6-inch long samples that are usually put between two base plates or just a slotted base, and then a compressive compression platen is lowered, touch on the sample, compress to a known deflection or to the point of failure, and then measure the ECT, or the actual maximum force it takes to actually collapse the sample. Once again, the ideal testers for ECT are either motorized force test stands for very simple test applications, or software-driven force testers to perform the actual calculations that will yield the force per sample width results that you're looking for. Once again, Fixtures for ECT are usually customized depending on the type of sample being tested. So as you can see in the images here, that first part uses a slot in the base plate and a round compression platen. And then, however, usually you'd see that scenario in the middle image that has the two blocks on the base that actually stabilizes the sample, and then you'll have a compression platen on the top that comes down to compress the sample to failure. So again, the test fixtures will come in different sizes depending on your actual test requirements or your sample sizes. They may be round, square, or rectangular, once again, depending on your test samples. Now, if you're testing to a TAPI standard or an ASTM standard, then there may be specific requirements on what those fixtures should look like. So, but typically you would find the base stabilizing blocks or a base plate with a slot, and then you'd have the upper compression plate. Or in very unique applications, you'll have image number 3 on the right side that targets the corners. Again, this is kind of simulating more of a real life application on how the sample is more likely to fail. So there are all different types of ways of testing for edge crush strength. So these are the 3 types of test samples that, fixtures that you would usually see in an ECT. Carton crush testing, again, is the measurement of the compressive strength of corrugated cartons and boxes. You'll find the carton crush or box crush test. If there is ECT, then there is a BCT, which is a box crush test. So this usually involves the entire box or carton being crushed, and then again measuring one of 3 things: either the force at a known deflection, or the deflection at a known force, or the force and or deflection at the point of deformation. So again, it's commonly used to assess the effect of applying an axial top load force on the flat sides of carton boxes to simulate stacking them in a warehouse or during transportation. Again, the test is measured by compressing the sample across its entire surface area, and this compression test is performed as a destructive or a non-destructive test. So in a typical destructive test, this is where you would either crush it to a known deflection or apply a known force or apply it until the sample fails. But usually in a non-destructive testing, you just want to see, especially if you're doing 100% testing. So you're making these cartons and you want to know if they meet a certain criteria of, say, 200 pounds of axial force or axial load. So once the sample is put in the tester, you apply a known force, 200 pounds, 100 pounds. As long as the sample meets that minimum criteria without failing, it's a good sample. You just pack them for shipping. So these again, that's how you usually would go about a non-destructive test. Once again, choosing the ideal testers. Now, again, because you are testing an entire carton, you obviously need all the space you can get. And so typically, single column units, unless these are very small boxes, the preference is for dual column units to allow you all the testing area or the space between the columns to test your containers or your boxes or your cartons. So again, because of some of the calculations involved, and also the size of the cartons that are being tested, the size of the samples, our preference is for a dual column and a software-driven tester. So our OmniTest software-driven tester for regular cartons that you would see in a typical, package, and then for larger cartons, anywhere from 36 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, and so on. We would be looking at the Squeezer Pro, which was designed to do exactly this: the ability to compress cartons or boxes, and then measure one of the 3 different pieces of data that you're looking for in any one of the 3 test procedures we've previously discussed. And then for the types of fixtures that are used, again, we're looking at the entire surface area of the cartons. So you'll see, again, different sizes and materials depending on how much axial load is required. These fixtures can be square or rectangular. They can be either static or self-leveling, or they can be freestanding or with guided rods. So the guided rods is in that if in first image, as you can see, the center there attaches to the load cell to measure the compressive force. Now, these are for really large containers. You'll also see a similar setup when the Squeezer Pro. Um, I prefer this type of setup for larger boxes because then you're not exerting too much load on the load cell that needs to be teared out with each test. But then there are also instances where you can just use large compression platens on the top and the bottom to perform a test. So these are the types of fixtures that you would usually see in a carton or BCT. Establishing consistency and repeatability in a test. This is going to form the bulk of our conversation here. So first, we'll go into defining the test objective, as in what are you looking for? Again, whether you're in quality or production or R&D, the question is, what are we looking for in this test, right? Because it's almost like going on a trip without a destination. We need to figure out what the testing objective is. Are we looking for the deflection when a known force is applied? Are we looking for the maximum force when the sample is compressed to a known displacement? Or are we looking for the point of failure when we just test until the sample fails? This is critical to the test because in relaying that objective to operators, it's important they know exactly what they're testing for, or else the data means absolutely nothing. So that's the first part. The first point or the first factor in establishing a consistent and repeatable testing environment is define the test objective. Why are we even testing this? And what are we looking for? The next part is to establish a testing standard or requirement. So is this going to be our own in-house test standard or test procedure because our samples are so unique, or are we testing to a specific ASTM standard that dictates the sample preparation, the sample sizes, the sample fixturing, the speed of the test, what types of data we're looking for in the test, and so on. And you usually find these in a typical ASTM standard or a TAPI or an ISO standard, whichever one, or your own internal standard, whichever one you decide to go with, that has to be included in your SOPs, as in this is what we're testing for. And then the next logical part, which we've just previously addressed, is determine the appropriate testing equipment. Huge example here is ideally a freestanding vertical tester with a single column will do most test applications, right? However, the size of the sample will also determine whether that single column unit or vertical tester has enough throat depth and enough of a testing area on the base to accommodate your sample, because you don't want any overhangs or overlaps. So that is critical. The size of the sample will determine the type of tester that you're going for. If it's just as I said, small gift box, you can get away with a single column tester. If you're a mom and pop operation or a small business that's just looking to get a value or even to do some supplier audits, you could get by with a simple motorized tester. If you're in the R&D or quality department and you're looking to get as much data as you can from your product, then obviously a software-driven tester is more ideal because you're looking to generate as much data through all the different complex calculations and nuances in the test as possible. So these are some of the factors that go into selecting that the appropriate testing equipment. And also with each testing equipment comes, the equipment actually is a combination of tester, load cell, and or force gauge. And then of course the fixtures, which we will talk about here momentarily. So if the typical requirement of our target compressive load is 200 pounds, then we need to make sure we have a load cell or force gauge that can accommodate that force and still leave enough of a cushion so if there are any outliers out there, we don't end up overloading the load cell or force gauge. So that combination of tester and load cell takes into consideration not simply the size of the sample, but also how much the target force or the maximum force required in the test application is. So in a typical 200-pound test, I would go for a 500-pound load cell because if there are outliers, you still have enough of a cushion without overloading the load cell. so on. And then that next step is obviously the types of fixtures that can be used. So again, if we've determined the testing objective for the product, is it a top load test? Great. What are we testing for? It's going to be testing for force at a known deflection. Great. Now, what's that sample size? What type of tester are we using? Is it a single column? Is it a dual column? What's the bottle opening? What kind of compression platen are we using? Is the container rectangular? Is it oval? Is it square? That would essentially determine the type of compression platen that's being used. Does it have an uneven surface? In that case, we should be looking at a self-leveling compression platen. Does it have a slippery surface? In that case, we should be looking at a rubber-coated compression platen. So these are all the questions that come into play in the process of selecting the ideal fixtures to set up with your ideal testing equipment, which is tester, force gauge, or load cell. And then developing an SOP for operators, because in the event where all of these boxes have been checked off, we've defined the testing objective, we've established the testing standards, whether it's going to be an in-house standard or an ASTM standard or ISO standard or a TAPI or whatever. Next, we've selected the appropriate equipment. We've selected the ideal test grips and fixtures. There are also factors that might go into determining or establishing a consistent and repeatable testing environment. And these are some of the ones that are a little difficult to control because, again, if you preset your tester to run at 10 inches per minute to a deflection of a 1/4 inch each time, it will do that every time. Load cell will measure what it needs to measure. Your potentiometer will measure the displacement. The software will do all the calculations. However, what about the sample sizes? Right? Are all the samples being tested the exact same? So, okay, we're testing a 10-inch rectangular 10 by 4 by 6 sample. That's what we're testing in this batch. We recommend that in that SOP, we should say test like for like, which makes the data analysis a little easier because then you're comparing like for like. You test 20 samples, they're all the same. And then if there are any outliers, you'll be able to catch them. Mixing them up with different sizes of samples might create a little bit of confusion in data analysis. So that's the first part. Sample size is critical. Sample positioning is critical. If we're all placing in a rectangular sample, are we going to place it laterally or are we going to place it axial? However you're looking to place those samples under those compression platens, that is also important to the test. If you're going to shift off to the right side or left side or whatever you determine to be the ideal way to test the sample, that needs to be written into the SOP so all the operators are doing the exact same thing every single time. That way you don't have any deviation, because it's always when humans are involved, I apologize for saying this, but it's the truth, that's when you find a lot of variation and you might create errors in your testing procedure. So that sample size, sample placement, again, I'm going to go back real quick to sample sizing, especially in ECT, when you're doing edge crush testing and you're cutting flaps off of your corrugated cardboard boxes. Again, there are testing standards you can subscribe to, which determines essentially exactly what sizes you're cutting. Again, however, if you're testing to an in-house standard, then you can establish a standard operating procedure that says all samples should be, whether it's single wall, triple wall, double wall, they should be cut to 2 inches wide by 6 inches long. And that's how it's going to be, depending on which samples you're testing or which testing standard you're subscribing to. Again, if it's an in-house standard and you're determining, even that has to be written that into the SOP. Again, what kind of environmental conditions are affecting the actual test? What is it too hot? Is it too cold? Because some samples may actually react to the testing environment, whether it's too hot or too cold. There might be moisture in the boxes that cause it to output weaker than normal values. And when it's too cold, it might be a little stiffer and it might output higher than normal values. However, whatever the ideal testing environment and testing temperatures are, that needs to be written into the SOPs. It sounds like it's not a big deal, but it might be a big deal when you start to see numbers deviate a little bit. I always recommend this. Do the most. right? Make a list, check off all of them, make sure you're checking off all of these boxes and you're answering all the questions before, because as I mentioned, the tester will do what it does. Where the variation comes in is in the stuff that is a little harder to control. Humans, the environment, and so on. Oily fingers, whatever, like greasy fingers on the samples that might create different abnormalities in the test and so on. Again, all of those are factors that need to be taken into consideration. So sample size, sample placement, sample preparation, environmental conditions in the testing area, those are all critical keys to establishing consistent and repeatable testing environments. And then finally, once you've checked off all of these boxes and they're all checked out, the next thing is, if you're still getting values that are all over the place, it's okay to check the actual product, because sometimes there might be anomalies in there. Hey, on this line, we were expecting triple wall, double wall, but for some reason, somebody pushed a different button and it's outputting single wall. And that's the reason why when we called up our double wall test, everything is failing. It's not meeting our minimum requirement. Why? Because the lot that we got in here, or the sample size we put in here, or the batch, is all single wall, even though they were supposed to be double wall. It's always okay to go back and check just to make sure. But guaranteed, once all of these boxes are established, you can pretty much set up a repeatable and consistent testing environment. There are other factors which are difficult to control, but for the most part, these are the main ones that go towards establishing that consistent and repeatable testing environment. And with that, we'll come to our questions, and I'll hand you all over to Sharon.
Thank you so much, Moses. I am seeing if there's any questions. I can't see any at the moment, but just for anybody
Okay.
who's still collecting their thoughts, if you have any questions and have not yet submitted them, you can do so now via the question box, and we will be able to give you an answer to those. And I know I have received requests from people asking whether the presentation will be made available to them. The answer is yes. As always, we record the presentations and send that out, hopefully tomorrow already, but if not tomorrow, in the next few days, it will be before the end of the week at the very least. I'm just going to give it 1 second to see if there's any questions that we have not addressed. But as Moses also said, if you do not currently have a question, but after giving it some thought, you have some questions or need further clarification, you'll see that there's 2 emails at the bottom of the screen. One is info@mecmesin.com, and the other one is Moses's direct email, which is just moses.derosha@pptgroup.com. And you're welcome to use either of those to reach out to us.
And just to add this quickly, guys, in the coming days, we're also looking to, as much as space will allow, perform actual live demonstrations of the topics we've covered here. I know sometimes just the fundamentals are, for those of us who are not in the industry, a little difficult to wrap our heads around, but a live demonstration essentially kind of shows you in real time what these typical applications look like. At best, we should be able to perform an ECT and topload testing on plastics to essentially demonstrate everything we've talked about here in this presentation. Back to you, Sharon.
Thanks, Moses. I don't see any questions, so
Okay.
I think we are going to end the webinar for today. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you for presenting, Moses.
No problem. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. We hope to see you on another webinar. Have a good day.